Welcome to the fourth and last part of this tutorial on the synthetic geometry of our life world. So far, we have seen why time is so problematic and so important in science and philosophy in part 1. We have learned what synthetic geometry is and why it could be useful for philosophy in part 2. In part 3, I discussed what dimensions actually are and why I reject Minkowski's spacetime model. And finally, now in this part, I will apply all together to the theory of the life world, call it roughly our reality, as developed by Alfred Schutz in 1923 in his work The Meaningful Structure of the Social World. When Alfred Schutz worked on his book, he tried to explain how social sciences, from the point of view of praxeology, would look like. Praxeology is a theory that puts in the center of all social life the individual human who acts. Schutz also worked with 4 dimensions along the axiomatic concepts consciousness, actuality, concreteness, proximity, and anonymity. Be aware, these concepts are axiomatic. This means they are not used in the sense of everyday language, but very precisely defined at a high level of abstraction. The following table resumes the synthetic geometry of Schutz's social world. Remember, measurements are not material existential entities. They are standardization of arbitrary empirical, which means material, relations that are meaningful to human life. For example, a meter is derived from steps or an elbow length, etc. This also applies to time. Time is based on the relation of the intervals when celestial objects are observed by the human eye. Thus, in many cases, they are relations between the movement of planet Earth and other bodies, especially Sun, Moon, and Venus. There is no such thing as time out there. Time is a function. In other words, there is so much scientific correctness and precision in time as there is in English grammar. As a note aside, AI struggles with the same problem as we do. Life and language are not axiomatically perfect. In short, we could say AI struggles to become a person, which means to exist materially and transcendently. And we want to become a sort of God, to transcend. 2 things are frightening about AI. A, what other people can do with it to us. And B, that we will never be God as long as no AI can become a person. Offensive to God? Depends on your God, I guess. Dangerous? Yes, because persons are dangerous. But this is another topic. You can read a lot about this in my book. I only mention this because the question of time will be central in developing AI further, which is so much related to the question of identity and personhood. That also bothered me. But now, let's return to Alfred Schutz's meaningful structure of the social world. First, I shall introduce you an overview, and in the following we shall go from one point to the other step by step. As you see, here is this tesseract I have introduced before. At different positions there are bicolored balls in violet and black. These are entities. We shall see what that exactly means. You can see that they are numbered and labeled from 1 to 7. Self, a fellow agent, contemporary agent, ancestors, historical characters, descendants, and fictional characters. Then there are the 4 dimensions, signaled with the letters X, Y, Z and W, which are 0 dimensions of consciousness, first dimension for actuality, second dimension for concreteness, third dimension for proximity, and the fourth dimension for anonymity. Let's start. As you might infer, the balls are somehow related to different forms of human existence and relations. In principle, it is assumed that being a person is a dual phenomenon composed of a body and a mind. The difficulty is to define what body and mind actually mean and how they relate. Along with Alfred Schutz, I understand that concept in line with Bergson, Suribi and Lain-Entralgo as a form of critical monism, as we can also find in Descartes, at least the late Descartes. To explain it for non-philosophers, stop thinking of the body as a container which is filled with the mind. Forget all those Hollywood movies where a sort of light gets out of the body into the sky whenever a person dies. Rather, imagine these two concepts like the two sides of a coin. You cannot separate them. If you split a coin in half, you will not get a foreside and a backside. You will get two halves of the coin, each with its fore and backside. You might meditate on that in another occasion. Here, this is not the most relevant problem. The key is that one aspect of the person, or the embodied mind, belongs to the dimension of totality. This is the dimension 0. It is the absolute potential of anything, but without anything being defined yet. This idea is built on the Neoplatonist philosophy of Plotinus, and it is very nicely explained by Jesus de Garay. Where I want to get you is that this aspect is unknown even to ourselves. Anything related to the dimension 0 is unknown to anybody. Therefore, we could only represent it here as a blank sheet. Remember, in geometry, a point has no dimension and cannot be drawn. This is why we usually make a cross to symbolize a point. Because drawing a period to a point gives the wrong idea that the point has an expansion in time. A point in geometry can be compared to a single person in the sense that a single person is only a potential, but it cannot really exist. To exist as a person means to be cautious about ourself. But for cautiousness, a self needs another. Therefore, persons can only exist in community with others. A very detailed explanation for this phenomenon from the philosophical, the anthropological, and the biological perspective is given in the extended work of Pedro Lain-Entralgo. To come back to our graphic, only the violet parts of the entities are known. The black part belongs to the unknown, and so does everything outside of the tesseract. Through perception, the potential person can perceive other entities and take action. Action is the first category here. When I say categories, I refer to axioms, theoretical concepts, to explain a mental model. This is taken from Aristotle, who in his work Categories made his own intent to describe the world with a framework based on axioms. He names being as the first category. In my book, Principles of Liberty, I explain why this is not correct and why we have to take action as the first category. In other words, becoming, not being. This is also consistent with the theory of Alfred Schutz, who bases his whole framework on praxeology, a theory that, prior to anything else, understands persons as entities that engage in purposeful behavior, which comes before perception. Well, when looking at this slide, you will have to consider two more aspects. I do not define persons as human beings. There is no logical, scientific, or empirical justification to make such a statement. Therefore, the possibility of other than human persons remains open. I believe this is important, not only to include different religious aspects and philosophies which are not monotheistic. This would be an intention that is not aligned with mine, but foremost because limiting something in science which has no necessity from a scientific point of view will limit also our results and probably falsify them in a very strong way. I believe that there has been a lot of lack in progress in this field because each and every scientist I was reading of, including Alfred Schutz, said only human beings can be persons. And in the same sentence they added, but I don't know why. There is no reason for it, but I just feel it is like that, or I just believe it must be like that. I will not do that. I keep it open. And we should do that unless we find a proof that only human beings can be persons. Further, the whole process that follows does not happen a long time, but at once. Neuroscience can discern biological processes related to thinking in the brain and arrange them in a chronological order, especially in research on memory functions. Also, psychology and pedagogy about language acquisition can hierarchically order different processes related to consciousness. But we cannot do that in synthetic geometry, at least not in this framework. So there is at the moment no factor of time here. That is something that happens before time, that happens at once. These are most useful theories, and you will find some insight of them in my work. I refer to psychology and pedagogy and so on. But please do not let yourself be confused by thinking that the becoming a person and the becoming of the social world are chronological developments. We simply do not know if they have some specific order throughout time. The problem is that as far as we know, there are no single living entities. Think of an amoeba. It splits off from another amoeba. Or a human baby grows in the belly of a human mother, and so on. It is even supposed that all planets in some form already existed in the black hole. So we have some intuition that nothing comes alone, but it is a problematic intuition which cannot satisfactorily be explained and tested. For us here, it is not important. Simply consider that we are speaking of logic that arranges things in a causal order, but many of the following processes might happen simultaneously. Remember, never confuse causality with time. Therefore, I have labeled the line at the bottom arrow of causality and not arrow of time. For aesthetic conveniences, I made it progress from the right to the left, which might have a strange feel to readers of most languages, but speakers of Arabic, Aramaic, Azeri, Jivehi, Kurdish, Sorani, Farsi, Urdu, and the more flexible writing systems such as Chinese, Japanese, and Korean will be quite familiar with it. So for all the rest, take the opportunity to change perspective. So, number 1 is awake, actively perceives another and addresses it. For example, one might kick 2. Have you ever done that with a stone? Bump into it. I have done that with a crystal. Or more in human style, speak to it. You can already perceive from these words that encounter is something very concrete. Now, there are 4 options. 2 is not a person and will not reply. 2 is a person but cannot hear 1 and therefore does not answer. 2 is a person, can hear 1 but rejects to answer. 2 is a person and answers, but 1 cannot hear it speaking, so ignores 2's personhood. 2 is a personified and answers, but 1 does not want to respect 2's personhood and treats the person as an object. And finally, 2 is personified and answers. 1 hears 2, and they engage in a discourse. To speak must not be understood in the strict sense of using vocals and language to exchange information with each other. There can be many non-verbal forms that have the same effect. Whenever I speak about talkability, the ability to speak or to engage in a discourse, I refer to this broader understanding of discourse and speech acts. There are many reasons why a discourse might fail. The important point is that A, the self, is only updated, actualized, as a person when it actively engages in discourse with another person. Recognition is always mutual. Let's continue. This is a schematic overview of the mutual recognition from which one becomes a person, based on Plotinos and the anthropology of Laín and Tralgo. If you are interested in it, I can record another video that digs deeper into this fascinating problem. For the purpose here, just keep in mind that a single person cannot exist, and that persons mutually generate each other through an act of communication. The engagement in discourse between 2 persons is called an encounter. Such an encounter is an event that has a causal impact on the mind. Once recognized the other as a person, it cannot be undone. It is irreversible and constitutive. That doesn't mean that one cannot mistakenly take anything as a person, which in reality is not, as for example in the case of fetishism. But where it is a genuine encounter, it creates something new in the other person and reaffirms the self and transforms it, which contributes to the process of becoming. However, in the social world of Schutz, things are much simpler. 2 people who meet are fellow agents. To be an agent means to act. We can only act in actuality, in the present. Past actions are fossilized memories of our actions and experiences, but they are not actions as such and experiences in themselves. We can also frame it otherwise. The acting is always something concrete, and it is only possible within the material existence. This is always actuality, the very moment. For this reason, the 2 dimensions, Y, concreteness, and X, actuality, come together at the position of the self, the right lower corner. Equally, as we cannot fully know ourselves, pure action, as well as pure perception, cannot be decoded completely by the mind, because as soon as we reflect on them, they were already in the past. Reflection needs actions to be concluded. Once a discourse has happened, we know the other person is a person, even if that person is not around and speaking with us anymore. How many persons? It is an irreversible process and remains as a memory. This means that there is a type of entity which is not a fellow agent, because it does not directly engage with us. We call that a contemporary. We know they are persons in an indirect, less concrete way, either through our memory when we had a real encounter with them in the past, or more actually through the report of others who tell us about people we have never met, or the impact their actions have on our lives without directly engaging with them. All these are contemporaries. They live and act at the same time without direct contact. The knowledge of their personhood is certainly less strong. We have less evidence or proof, and rely more on habits and belief. In cognitive science, this related to the habit loop. As soon as contemporary enters our field of interaction and engages in a direct discourse, it is reaffirmed as a person. In parallel, new entities enter our discourse and become part of our life world as fellows, while others leave the discourse temporarily or permanently to become contemporaries. Altogether, this creates a field of knowledge through discourse which can be illustrated as a plane. As already mentioned, contemporaries, whose direct contact is farther back, are also less concrete in our consciousness. Their absence can be temporary or permanent, even though during one's life we are never certain how permanent something is. We all know from childhood how often somebody says, "I will never speak to you again," and shortly after we are having another nice conversation. The only permanent absence is death. People who have died will not speak to us again, unless we can speak to the dead. Such examples are given by the witch of Endor, who conjured the prophet Samuel on the command of King Saul, if we can believe the biblical text. There are other testimonies, and the interesting question remains if only people from around 1000 years before the Common Era, when Samuel was born, can be contacted, or also those of earlier times, such as the artist of the Venus of Willendorf around 30,000 years ago, or even the artisan of the Lomekwi stone tools 3 million years ago. Even though this is certainly an interesting question for both natural science and religion, in sociology it is less relevant, because the social world is built only from what is accessible to our experience and knowledge. Thus, as soon as someone disappears from our world through death, it is an ancestor. If this ancestor share a whole life with us, it is a contemporary ancestor, and if not, simply an ancestor. If we encounter persons, and it's us who live this life before them, they would be contemporary descendants. The encounter with persons who have been here before us, or will be here after us, is what creates the idea of an era of time in our mind. The world is only accessible, which means knowable, to our mind from one's own experience. It is from this perspective, the viewpoint of the self, that the whole life world is created. The chronology is a phenomenon that is mainly generated from these experiences. First, the irreversibility of certain actions makes that some actions create a sense of before and after. Second, living with contemporaries whose lifespan is not completely parallel, expand our imagination beyond our own lives. The first effect of irreversibility makes that this arrow of time goes in one direction, just as if it was a flow. This is how our mind shapes the idea of the world in us. It is not how the world is. We have actually no means to know how the world is beyond our experience and imagination of it. This is why some cultures also speak of the wheel of reality or the illusion of reality, as in the case of the Indian goddess Maya. Again, reality in large part is outside of the Tesseract, which means outside of our knowledge. Within the boundaries that is existence. As a definition, the arrow of time is generated by the experience of contemporarity and the limits of it, encounter with fellows and indirect encounter with contemporaries, mediated through memory, report and inference. Resuming, the combined experience of irreversibility of certain actions or successes, such as death, creates this arrow of causality, and the limits of contemporarity creates the arrow of time. Together they create our notion of time. Irreversible actions or successes are defined as events. If this notion is reflected and explained with a more or less consistent and coherent framework, we can speak of a theory of time. In some way we all have our theory of time, but some are more formally defined and often adopted, such as Minkowski space that describes the block universe, a four-dimensional field of the three dimensions of physical space, and the fourth dimension as time. This theory was in similar way also used by Einstein and became highly popular through him. It is still the most common standard idea of time, even though it causes more troubles than solutions to both science and mathematics. Let's return to our frame. Ancestors can be contemporary, so we have memories of them. This may be the case for our parents, grandparents, perhaps even great-grandparents and their fellows. Some ancestors are not directly known by us, either because they did not coincide or because they died before we were born. In that case, we have only a mediated knowledge through reports by other fellow agents and contemporaries. Our knowledge is inferred from that or constructed by our memory. Making deductions on similarities and causalities, we can now also infer personhood based on artifacts. No one we ever have known has met such a person, and still we are convinced that they existed. This is, for example, the case with Aristotle, whose existence is deduced from his written works as artifacts. We call these persons historical figures. Such a knowledge, of course, is much less concrete and not actual at all. How often it turned out that something was written by another person than the one who is declared author, or even that the author never existed and is a poor invention of the real author. Similar problems arise from other types of artifacts. The more indirect and the more backwards in time other persons lived, less certain is anything we can know about them. Another problem that arises is proximity. Proximity refers to a shared knowledge, a shared experience or culture. Of course, we cannot share concrete, actual experience with people who are not contemporaries. We all know how even the meaning of words shifts throughout time. But still, making conclusions from people who spoke the same language, shared a culture, lived in the same area, or engaged in similar activities is still much easier and of a more certain outcome than making conclusions about people who never shared any of this with us. Therefore, proximity applies to all entities, not only ancestors. There can be encounter we have with people of the same culture and language, or encounter with people from a totally different cultural background. The latter will be an encounter of less proximity, with all its related difficulties and uncertainties. As we see, all dimensions are synchronously applied, as in a cube. All the lines together form a cube on which each case can be positioned on one of the points within the three-dimensional space. Before we continue, we should have another look at the concept of Lifeworld. Lifeworld is the idea that an individual has in its mind about the world. It is constructed mainly based on the experience of contemporaneity. It is the irreversibility of events and the era of time inferred from the overlapping parallel lifespans with divergent dates of start and end. Depending on each one's perspective, the life world shifts. There are events that are relevant to it and others that not. Here we see the lifespan of the perspective of the person gamma. In contrast, we have the lifespan of the person epsilon. They live at the same time, but epsilon lives longer and is born earlier. The same applies for beta, delta, eta and zeta. And I wonder why I chose so arbitrary letters when I designed this graph. Anyways, we can also see on this slide at the bottom the era of time, and at the right side the social space. If we add events on the era of time, we clearly see that not all persons can presence them. The relevance of these events will change much from one life story to the other. Further, the social space, which means the place of living, the social class, and the activities these people engaged in, further limits their experiences. With some persons, experiences and worldview overlap. With others, less, and with some we do not share anything at all. People in the same circle represent fellows who share a life world, at least in part. Those with parallel lifespans, contemporaries. In the same way as predecessors ancestors who have died before our lifespan are only known indirectly, also descendants who are born after our death can only be known in an indirect way. However, the mechanisms are different for a simple reason. Predecessors may leave artifacts behind, at least oral reports of our contemporaries and fellow agents. On the contrary, descendants have no material representation. They are mere products of our mind. Even though we imagine both of them and can never fully know how predecessors were, we do know what they left behind. Not the meaning of it, but that there is something, what they left behind. For our descendants we need another type of mental anchor. One way is to infer it from the symmetrical extension of the era of time towards an infinite future, mediated through culture. So, since my grandmother had children and my mother, I will have and they will have and so on. We immediately see that this makes no sense and is completely unscientific, because we cannot conclude that anybody in the future will have children just because our ancestors had. That this is not always the case is proved by all those species who are extinct. a species might come to an end for whatever reasons, and this applies to any other extrapolation towards the imagined future. And yet, that's what our mind does. This is related to the stochastic iteration of the search for symmetry and patterns that are common to all thought processes. What I mean by this is that our mind is a kind of computer that processes always in terms of yes or no, something is something or it is not, and then it computes the next question. And it looks for patterns and for symmetry. And this makes that we also extrapolate things, that we take conclusions from the past for the future. Our mind is not thinking in a scientific way. Our mind is thinking in a narrative way, and this is this yes, no, and what was, will be, and so on. When we become clear about the fictional character of the idea of our descendants, then we see how close they are to fictional characters in literature. Fictional characters can be in less proximity. This would be the case of a character created by another whom we do not know and who does not belong to our shared culture. A fictional character, however, can also be closer, for example, because we have created it, based on a fellow agent or our own self, which it represents in some way. Thus all fictional characters are in some way creative recombinations of past entities. Here I show again another slide from another presentation, which I can publish if you are interested. This creative act of imagining a future based on our past experiences in the story we make up from artifacts of a more distant past leads to a vision of the future, an ideal life world, or in the opposite, a dystopic one. One's individual psychology and internal conflicts influence highly this process. It motivates our intentions that lead to actions. Since there are manifold divergent factors that differ from one person to the other, also our visions of the future can only be overlapping in the best case and may have many different forms. In this slide, A, B, and C are different persons who imagine their future position at different points within the social world. X and Y are internal conflicts that can lead to tensions. This is only to illustrate how complex and open the whole process is. I shall explain this topic in more detail otherwise. What is relevant here is to understand that different visions of the future motivate a constant mutual manipulation between persons who try to transform and shape their world to their liking, and what is even more important, in their image. With this, finally we have reconstructed the Tesseract. And now you can see we have these two aspects of time, the arrow of causality that leads from one side to the other as the process goes on, as we develop this world, and the other is the arrow of time. The arrow of time is any combination of two connections, for example, point 1 connecting to contemporaries and connecting to historical figures, realizes that there is a time span, that there is something that was before, and extrapolates that there will be something afterwards. So the arrow of time is in any position within this framework. We have also to consider that this four-dimensional life world is not fixed in an objective sense, but develops develops from the point of view of the self. If we look from the point of view of any other self, yours for example, the whole Tesseract would be the same, but it would shift within that unnamed space, unformed space of totality. I hope this has given you a little bit a better idea of what I speak in my book, and I kindly ask you, be critical, think yourself. Ask me if you do not understand something, because this helps also me to explain better and to rethink things. If I'm right, I will find a way to explain it better. And if I'm wrong, I need to know that, I need to discover that, because then I have to change something. So please write your comments, contact me, and feel free to share your ideas or what you think about it, if I'm right, if I'm wrong, if that is somehow intelligible, can you understand it, or do you need some more information, or shall I give you more examples? In any case, I will try to take the time and make more concrete examples as they appear in the book of Alfred Schutz a little later on this year. Many thanks for listening to me and taking all this effort to understand so complicated topics. I hope I see you soon.